Okay, so in this one, we're actually going to talk about the contract issue that we have in organizations and how we can use AI agents to help mitigate that. So let's talk about the problem that we have with contracts at the org level. On average, organizations that have 500 plus employees are spending annually anywhere around 3.1 million on legal spend, right? And this is obviously the larger the organization, the more this is going to be, the more contracts and legal transactions you have within the organization or the type of business you're in, the larger this is going to be. So this is a sizable chunk. 90%, even with that spend, 90% of the executives said there needs to be need for better contracts. And this could be better in many different senses. One, to make sure the quality of the contract's better, to make sure that as an organization, you're covered, your organization's covered, you're not exposed, you have the right clauses in there for protection. The other one could be the process, right? So on average, there was a number that it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks to have a contract review. If you're in a very fast-paced environment, 3 to 5 weeks to have a SOW review for your new client to sign, or maybe an existing client to sign the SOW with the understanding that you already gotten past that MSA stage. It's a very long time, especially in 2025. As we start to get into Q4 2025, this rate of speed, the rate of business is operating that much faster. 21 million waste in SaaS products. And this is contracts where you sign up for a platform, software as a service, or a platform as a service. In that contract, you probably earmark a certain number of licenses. That contract is set with an auto-renew clause. You lose track of that. That auto-renew can happen 24 months from the date of sign, 36 months from the date of sign. So the further out it is, if it's not like an annual thing that's on your radar, those kind of slip through the cracks. Auto-renew, you get that nut, you pay for that. You're responsible for paying for that next chunk of licensing. So you're renewing these contracts, you're paying for things that you no longer need, or you need to scale down, or maybe you need to scale up and get better pricing. The breach of contract, that's more so, again, this is where the C-suite has been through a scenario or a situation. They've been burnt, like there was a data breach or there was a cybersecurity issue or whatever the case may be. After the retrospective and the analysis, they realized that it probably was the fault of a particular vendor, or maybe a piece of hardware, or a piece of networking, or maybe security, wherever the case may be. They did not have the clause in there to make that third party or that vendor responsible for the breach. We're really clear on making sure we get the certificate of insurance, that we are the insured on their business insurance. We want to make sure that they're covered. And in our contract, it's clearly stated that if they're the cause of the breach, then they're responsible to where their insurance company pay. A lot of companies are absorbing this cost because of this lack of clause that's in there. So how do you make sure that as an executive, as a product owner, or wherever the case may be, a leader, and you're interacting with these clients and vendors and suppliers, that your contracts are tight? Simple contracts may be, again, we want them simple because we don't want to get caught up in the legalese. A lot of these clauses are wordsmithed in a way, it's almost like reading Shakespeare, to where you have to unearth like what's really in this contract, what's really going on. And this is where the AI agents can help executives, non-legal people, to really understand what they're signing. The last one, again, we're going to get into the solution architect between this, is contracts are hard to find, right? You signed the contract, you started this project, and now something came up. You want to understand like what's actually in the contract, who's responsible, what obligations you have as an organization or as a leader. So in this contracting agent, and this is a power agent, that's power agents meaning that they are built on Microsoft 365. They use the AI models, are hosted in Azure AI Foundry, but we use the Power Platform to bring all of that together. And this is going to give us one more robust control than versus a Copilot. These are significantly a lot cheaper to run within the organization versus Copilot, because these you're going to pay for usage, meaning that they actually are used in the service, they're using the program, they're using the automation, and you're paying for that, versus a Copilot seat where you're earmarking $30 per user with a 12-month commitment, and the utilization is probably low. So that's why we centralize a lot of these solutions around power agents, and we embrace this pattern to solve real business issues with this technology. So what does this look like? So what we have is we're going to use SharePoint, and we're going to have a document library stored inside of SharePoint, and this is where our contracts are going to be stored. So to solve the problem for contracts are not centralized, this is where we make all of the users who are interacting with contracts want to make sure that legal is aware that this contract exists, and two, that when they submit it, they're submitting it to the contract library. And again, how it gets into the library is going to vary from business to business, but the goal is to put all of these contracts in one central spot and then put in the right security measures that things that should be confidential are locked and they don't have read access, and only the right people have access to the right things at the right time. So we have a centralized location for the contracts, and that's table stake. We haven't built anything AI related yet. So now that we have the contract here, and this is the actual file, 90% of these are going to be uploaded with zero metadata. And when we say the metadata, this is where we're looking for things like, what is the auto renew? One, answer the question, does this contract have an auto renew clause? And that's going to be binary, yes or no. And then it's going to say, okay, what is the termination of this date? Some of these can be open-ended and no termination. Some of these may have a set date. If you need to terminate this contract, what's the clause or what steps are needed to terminate the contract? Is there an early termination fee? So all this metadata pieces you want to grab. What's the risk level? Risk level is subjective, right? Subjective even in the organization. The risk level for marketing may be different than regulatory, may be different than records management, records and retention management, may be different than lease agreements for office, or lease agreements for vehicles, or lease agreement for the private jet, wherever the case may be. So the risk level is subjective depending on the department and the area. So we need to be able to look at that based on the the contract type, the department that's governing it, and here we would give it a risk score, and then we will also give it the justification of why it gave it that risk score. And the risk score could be anywhere. Again, this is where from your organization or from your process, we unearth this. Is it a 1 through 5 risk score? Is it a 1 through 10 risk score? Or maybe it's a low, medium, high, critical, or very high risk score, right? So we can label those as well. The other thing that we have that's built into your compliance or your purview is your sensitivity label. Okay, by default, most of these are going to be internal only, but some of these contracts may be heavier than that to where they may be confidential or highly confidential or high secret or high secret or high security clearance type label, or the highest that you can get as far as sensitivity, right? So all of that would be labeled in. Now, usually to put in these labels before AI, we really have to have someone review it and drop in the metadata for these. Now, you do have SharePoint Premium as an option to this. And Microsoft has since then shifted from licensing SharePoint Premium per user to more of a pay as you go. So now it's like open to everyone. And as you use these features, you can license them in. The key difference that this Power Platform agent or this Power agent is going to have versus SharePoint Premium is that we're going to get way more control of how this extraction happens for the metadata, because what the Power agent is going to do is actually going to read the plain text of the contract and then determine the right metadata values based on these components, where SharePoint Premium is going to do a mapping. It's almost like what was it called? The form intelligent service or the form service within Azure, where you almost have to train it, almost like a machine learning type training, where you have, okay, give me an invoice, and you have the invoice and you highlight, oh, this is the invoice date, this is the invoice end date, this is the invoice number, and you highlight where on that document you want to pull off that metadata. This is not that. this is really leveraging the intelligence of the LLM. So when it comes to your contract, you're going to feed it all 200 pages of that contract, and it's going to extract those out. Now, how we create these agents or sub agents to do this unit of work, we since then pivoted and enhance our pattern on how to do that. Before, what we would do is that we would have our Power Automate run, and this would be a scheduled batch job. And basically what it would do is just iterate through each one of these items in that contract library one by one. And then from there, it would take that blob. It would say, okay, for this given contract, here's the blob or that represent the contract file. Run that through another subflow. And this is where we get our OCR. And what this would do is then return the plain text of that OCR back to the calling flow or the parent flow, and that would then entail save that into SharePoint. So here we got the plain text, and then from the plain text it was stored in SharePoint, so this would get updated. So now we have a designated column that's going to hold all of the plain text of the actual file. So we went through this OCR. What we love to do with this OCR, again, all of these are different components, are different modules, are in Power Automate, different subflows. This is the reason why all of our solutions, even though you may or may not promote these to higher Power Platform environment, leverage solutions so that way we can call these subflows in a meaningful way just by passing parameters and really treating them as sub processes or functions, right? So this is where, and because this OCR, regardless of the calling parent flow that's calling it, it's going to have very simple parameters. Give me the blob of the file represented as a string, so the stringified version of the blob. It's going to work its magic, and then it's going to return the plain text that represent that. I love this approach and this pattern because over time, we're using Azure Document Intelligence Services today. This can morph into more robust OCR type LLMs. Like, for example, Microsoft Document Intelligence Services is probably the better of the form, I don't know the exact name, form intelligence services or the form AI that was pre-chat GPT. I was going to say pre-COVID. That was pre-chat GPT. Now document intelligence is showing better quality results for that and different use cases as well, right? Because now it returns not just the plain text, but you can reproduce or recreate that document because now you have the coordinate position of every text element on that item. So for example, if you wanted to recreate a form in multiple languages, you would have those predefined positioning so where you can almost get it pixel for pixel perfect. Now, from here, we also just recently announced by Microsoft updates to Mistral, which are not Microsoft LLMs. Like this is a third-party LLM that Microsoft has within their LLM catalog within Azure AI Foundry. So now what we can do, and that could be best of breed, like when we're testing these out with these same blobs, right? So you send it a file to Document Intelligence Services, look at their results, look at the confidence score. You send it through Mistral, look at the results and look at the confidence score. And if this one, based on the file type, is better, and you get that consistently, that may be a candidate to where you want to upgrade this. And upgrading this, and regardless if I have several of these file extraction processes that require OCR, I can have 20, 30, 100 parent flows calling this child flow. My change is only in that child flow. And as long as I adhere to the signature, a stringified version of the blob coming in, plain text going out, none of these calling flows have to change. So my change is centralized in there. So we absolutely love this pattern and we reuse it when and where possible. We even grow this to use in the form of an agent, right? And when I say agent, I'm referring to an agent in its abstract sense. So here we're going to have a risk agent that's going to calculate the risk for this contract. Again, this is going to be a child flow. And what makes this risk agent different than this OCR does not require a prompt, right? This is more of a service. It has intelligence in it, but that's encapsulated, that's baked in, and it's going to process all of these blob files the exact same way. You can't control that of how it processes. Now you can control the output, and maybe it has parameters that you can set, but you're not creating a prompt to change that. The risk agent, on the other hand, does have a prompt, right? And this is what makes this an agent versus a service. So in this scenario, what we're going to do is take this plain text, run it through the risk agent, and it's going to have all the plain text for that contract, and it's going to identify what the risk levels based on the subjective area that it needs to rank the risk against, right? So again, in my previous example, if it's for car leases, there may be a certain level of risk, and there may be certain things to look out for. If it's regulatory requirement for renewable energy, there are several things that you have to rank it up against and then give a risk level in for it. So what it's going to do is going to run that blob inside, go against the prompt catalog. So over here, we have a prompt catalog, and our prompt catalog is nothing more than a SharePoint list. And in this SharePoint list, basically what the calling flow, and any agent can call this prompt catalog, is that it will give it a prompt key. And this is usually in the title field of the SharePoint list. And then from there, we use a multi-line text field for each one of these prompts, and we detail out what the prompt is. And then we return that description here. So now the agent has based on the key it was given, it has a description, and then it calls another reusable service, which is our LLM. Now, this LLM call is going to be the LLM that's going to be hosted in Azure AI Foundry. And this is one of those areas in the pattern to where we make this extremely robust and flexible, because one of the things that we started out with, so V1 of this framework that we're creating, we would have the risk agent do all of the LLM calls within that flow. And then we will create another flow or another agent that was responsible for the executive summary, right? And basically it does the same thing. You pass in the plain text that you want to summarize, and then it will have its own key. It will go to the prompt catalog, grab its key. Based on the key for the executive summary for contracts, it will return that back, and then it will return that back to the calling flow, and the calling flow will know how to update the SharePoint list. And this executive summary will do the exact same. It will take that key, that prompt, it will create the message array, it will call the LLM, and then it will go. So we quickly identified that these pieces here were always the same. We had to look at them in the extract, and really just abstract and really look at what components, like how you parameterize these, and then make a reusable flow to where all this engineering is encapsulated into one spot. And this now is pass me the prompt key. You're always going to get the prompt catalog. You're always going to take the description of that prompt catalog. You're always going to have a user message, and you're always going to have a message array in a certain structure: system, user, and then assistant once the LLM respond. So these calls to the LLM, we made this encapsulated to now any one of these agents can call this LLM, and now all your engineering to call this LLM is encapsulated. So that was one, and we saw that pretty early in the process. The other thing that we enhanced once we started playing around with this concept was that when this agent would call the LLM in this generic sense, it would then have to specify which model of the LLM. In this scenario, we were always scoped to OpenAI hosted in Azure. So it would have to call and say, oh, I want you to use the 3.5 model, or the 4.0 model, or the O1 model, or the whatever the case may be. So it had to be aware of, in Azure AI Foundry, which deployment AI models we had available, and it would have to call these by the actual version name, right? At that time, then we quickly realized, you know what? This is going to create a maintenance nightmare, especially as fast as these LLMs are evolving, right? So we went from 3.0 to GPT-5 in a matter of what, 3 years? Less than 3 years. So less than 36 months. And we had so many iterations between these two, right? And this is important because not only did the AI get better with its smarts and intelligence and how it responded and how to readjust your prompts to get the best quality of the results, so on and so forth, they actually got cheaper. So as this thing progresses, you're going to go like to run 3.0 now is going to be, if you can still find it, a model version that's available, it's going to be way more expensive than the smarter one in GPT-5. So it's really up to you. It's in your best interest, in your organization best interest, to stay abreast of how these models are progressing and to keep your solutions up to date with the latest and greatest when and where it makes sense, right? So from here, so instead of having the agent call the model version, we then extract it out and say, you know what? When you're calling the model, just tell us if you want a standard model, and we'll define what that maps to in the Azure AI Foundry deployment for OpenAI. If you need a mini model, a deep thinking model, or a research model. And now we're adding the new one, and we haven't done this yet, is a web search, an AI search model that's grounded with the internet. So that's going to be like the web search. And these concepts come from what you have available to you today in ChatGPT. Now, I know a lot of this has changed a little bit recently with GPT-5 to figure it out. And then you also have, here's another one we're going to grow into is auto, right? So based on the auto, if you specify auto, or maybe you don't specify a model type that you want, if it's web, standard, reasoning, research, or mini, if you don't specify that, maybe we'll default to auto. And the auto will look at the Microsoft router, and it will be smart enough that says, okay, based on your system prompt and the text you have for your user record, I'm going to select this model, best of breed for your scenario, and then return you the results in the assistant record, right? So you have all that capability. What this allowed us to do was to keep all of the model mapping, so standard map to O1, or deep reasoning map to O3, or whatever the case may be. Like another one may map to mini, O3 mini, or something along those lines. So we did all of this mapping, and we encapsulated that here within this flow, making that the parameters to pass in very simple, right? So now that we have all of these agents separating, that was one of the things that we had to do, and we learned that very early on. Now, here's another thing that we noticed, and we actually noticed this when we tried to build one of our first agents, was that breaking these up to sub-agents is something that was new. And then we got this concept once we start to understand like the ADA, like the agent-to-agent calls, or the multi-agentic architecture and agentic architecture with orchestration versus autonomous. Mostly what we're doing now, we're leaning more so on the orchestration, because we want to make sure that those handouts are clear. We want to be able to dial in and zoom in to see how an agent is operating. Okay, like the risk agent, is it really scoring these correctly? And maybe we have a quality control agent, so on and so forth. So we break these up versus having one agent with this huge prompt instruction set. We got very mixed results. They were inconsistent, and the quality was medium to low. Here, the quality is going to be a lot higher, almost magnitudes higher, because this risk agent, all it has to do, its prompt may only be 6 lines of what it needs to consider to determine the risk and to provide a justification of very focused, right? And here's the other thing. You can mix and match now on when the risk agent runs its process, it probably just need a standard LLM versus an executive summary may need a deep reasoning LLM. So now we can mix and match these across the different agents that are needed to come up with these solutions. And we're building all of these agents independent. They have their own separation of concern, and how you call them, you can call them from any other solution, right? So that's how we break it down. So once we had that in place, this is what it looked like. So this is our prompt catalog, and I currently have a filter. Let me filter on the prompt group here. So all of these prompts here are related to the contract agent solution. Now we have this one requirement to where we need to translate some contracts over into Arabic. So this is the prompt for that. Very simple. You're a translator, translate the following to Arabic, right? And that's where we start. And that's when the other thing that we noticed that we didn't want to get, if you get too granular, if you start to overthink in the prompt, you kind of snap the AI into those limited guardrails. Sometimes that's good. And sometimes that is, hey, I can't anticipate all the different scenarios for Arabic. So let me start here. And then my Arabic speaking colleague can then proof it because they know English and Arabic. So they can proof it and say, yep, this is good. Because we all know, especially when it comes to translating, that if you do word for word, that translation, the context gets missed. So when you translate, you have to translate these within context, and that's what, that you get a much quality, better translation here. So that's the one for that. This is how we get the summary. And here you can see like you're a paralegal. I have what the core prompt needs to be. I also have what information about the output. Sometimes these outputs are very elaborate. Sometimes are JSON schemas. Sometimes they are very prescriptive HTML templates that we want. We're very clear to make sure that it's not providing us an entire HTML document, the one with the HTML tag, the header tag, and the body tag, because our downstream process won't be able to understand that. Like sometimes our downstream process just expects everything in the body tag. So we're very clear on how to handle that. So that's how you do the summary. Here's another thing that we did, the format output. So we have this risk agent, we have the executive summary, we may have another part summary, we may have the bounding states. I'm just making up different metadata options we have. So you have all these sub agents that's extracting their respective pieces of this contract. And then what we wanted to do was to get the results of all of these. They will be stored in their respective area within the site column of the document library. But we also wanted a final product that had all of these in that document, right? And we had different sections that made this consistent, almost like a template within this document. So maybe we'd start off with the executive summary. So we need the executive summary output here. And then we would start with the risk management. So we would have the risk agent do its output here. And before, we were having all of these agents output directly to the document. And that kind of locked us in, because what if this template changed? Now you have to hunt down all your agents, get their respective output, and update their output to match the new template change. Instead, what we're doing, instead of having them go directly to this output, directly to this template, we have an output formatter take in all of these inputs. So this is our output format agent taking all of these inputs, right? And then it will be responsible that says, okay, I got the risk, I got the executive summary, I have the main body of the content, I have the signatory section, I have the risk section, I have the start dates, I have the auto renewal decision, I have all this stuff. And then based off of that, it would then call its respective prompt within the prompt catalog and come up with a pretty well-defined format on the output, right? Which I don't show here. So I think you have like very simple, nice design HTML and ... right? And here's the other thing. For this one, we didn't have a predefined template per se, because the output was going to be in HTML. And we wanted the AI to have full control over that HTML on how to design it, like how to insert bullets when necessary, how to leverage a table when necessary, how to do paragraph tags and div tags to have it formatted, how to use section headers and titles. All of that we didn't want to define. Again, this is where we don't overthink for the LLM. Now, to your point, in some scenarios, you may want that. You may want all of my outputs to look exactly the same. Or maybe give it to the LLM that says, you know what, you have free range on how to do this, but your car leases should be the same. Your office lease agreement should be the same. Your MSA should be the same. So you define on what the same is and maybe give an example of what it used before. And that's how you drive consistency without using the nuance of defining the HTML for each one of these. Again, some of these are quick wins. You can come back and fine tune later, but to get these out the door, sometimes your prompts are very generic and basic. See what the AI, again, this is with GPT-5, these generic prompts are working actually more in your favor than less prescriptive prompts versus a GPT 3.5. Right? When we were doing this, if we did this, like this solution actually started in 4.1, but if this solution started back in the day when we had 3.5, those you had to be very prescriptive. That's when prompt engineering was a thing. Now it's more so, okay, where are the nuances of the AI and where are the guardrails and what is your process for creating the prompt and to fine tune it? We start broad, look at the results, and then fine tune versus trying to anticipate what we're going to get and start with a certain level 3 or level 4 fine tuning to circumvent and box ourselves in because now we're thinking for the AI versus giving it guardrails for it to think for itself, right? It seemed like a subtle difference, but the output and the results are hugely, drastically different, okay? So what does this look like in the document library? So let me show you this view in the document library. So these are all of our contracts. And this is the actual file. And then as we scroll over to the right, you will see that the risk level, this came from our risk level agent. And then the contract type, that's another one I didn't determine. The contract type is actually, you get a finite list of types. So that way you don't have like several different versions of what a car lease agreement type looks like, or it could be named or labeled. So we give it a finite list, and then based on the plain text that was extracted from the OCR, it will determine the type, right? It will read the document to determine the risk level. And then it will give the justification of why it gave it that risk level. It will extract out the contract start date and the contract end date. This is the big difference between SharePoint Premium and this Power Agent for contracting. With SharePoint Premium, for each one of these contracts, you have to map and say, oh, this is where the contract date would be. Here's an example of that. And you give it like 5 or 6 examples of contract date. You upload it, and then it's almost like machine learning. It kind of fine tunes and say, okay, I got it. Like you don't have to spell out every individual nuances, but you do have to provide me different scenarios. This Power Agent doesn't leverage that. We lean on the smartness of the AI. We give it the entire contract. It will determine based on semantics and context what the contract start date is, what the contract end date is. If it provides a date of 1/1/1900, that means the end date is open-ended. The renewal, it will read the contract and see if there's a auto renewal clause. This is where a lot of that money starts to leak with the SaaS metric that I showed you, right? This is where a contract was defined 3 years ago. The person who signed that up established that contract with the vendor who was very intimate with the dealings, the inner dealings of that contract, maybe moved on to a different department, maybe moved on to a different organization, and now someone who inherits or who's meant to be the custodian over those contracts have no idea about this renewal clause, right? They have no idea of when to get in front of it. And again, this renewal clause it will have the date of when it needs to renew. I don't think we capture that, but We need the date of when that auto renewal is going to happen, and then make sure we get in front of it. So if that's set to renew, and I'm going to make it up, October 2025, we want to start reviewing and having conversation with the vendor supplier in August of 2025, right? We're not going to wait until October or any closer to that date to where we don't have our questions answered. We don't have our clauses updated. We don't have the new redlining in place for this renewal, and we just have to accept whatever was in the terms of the previous version of the contract. That's why this is super important, and that's why we want to get in front of it. So here's the other thing. The termination period, some of these, in order to terminate the contract, there's certain things that you have to adhere to kill it, right? And then over here, we got payment terms. Notice what we're doing here in payment terms. The name of the person, the contact date. Oh, this is not right. No, I think this is an issue that we have. I think this is supposed to be a signatory. I dropped this in the wrong column, and I didn't catch it until after I had 1,000 of these already loaded. But anyway, so notice what we're doing here. Ignore the column names. These columns are mixed up. This is stored as JSON, and this is intentional, right? Because one of the things that when it comes to the signatory, we don't know how many people sign on the receiving end and on the giving end, like the leasee and the leaser, for example. We don't know what that can vary from contract to contract. So what we did, we established a JSON to give us enough flexibility to where they can add as many as they need, they can extract as many as they need based on the contract type. They may have different properties. They're going to be consistent with those properties for that contract type within that JSON. This helps us, and this is a new model that I love, storing JSON as the value within a SharePoint column, because it gives you a lot of flexibility without having to adjust your list schema to account for all these different nuances, right? You can quickly, trying to accommodate for all of these different permutations, create a hot mess in your schema, right? So storing this as JSON gives you a lot of flexibility, very similar to a NoSQL database where the schema is not defined horizontally. It's really defined in the value or vertically within that record. And that sets you up to storing many different schema types within the same table or container, right? So this is a pattern that's really starting to take off, especially when you deal with an AI or agentic solution and the output could vary. The AI is going to make its best decision, and you're going to give it guardrails. I need this output in this JSON schema, or I just need the output in the JSON schema. These are the core properties you must have. Any other properties you can add to it based on the type. Just be consistent. And be consistent, this is what we use for lease agreements for cars. This is what we use for lease agreements for offices. This is what we use for master service agreements, ... The contract summary, you can tell this is HTML, right? So this HTML, again, gives us a lot of flexibility. The AI can come in here and create however many HTML sections it needs, how many bullets it needs to really describe a section to make it more readable and readable friendly, or table schemas, so on and so forth. This raw text, this is the piece where all the raw data representing this contract is stored, right? So here, this is the actual contract itself. This is an example of these. And here's the thing, like I had to go and create all of these using AI. So all this sample data is AI, right? And that's the thing, when you build in POCs and proof of concepts and all this other good stuff, no one's going to let you play with their real contract here. And you don't want to play with their real contract. So here, all these different contract types had to be created. And we use a combination of Python and OpenAI. We actually used the public version of OpenAI for this, and then just had it crank it out. And I think it cranked out like 5,000 of these with a nice variation of different content types. But I really want to go into the properties of this so you can see the actual metadata. And what we're going to do is the next step is to put a custom Power App form on the SharePoint form, customize this to where we can have way more control over how this is laid out, right? So this is an example of the plain text, and we want this to come in unmodified. We really want this to come in character for character. It's using this markdown to recreate some of the sections in there. But the core responsibility for this is to get the text out exactly out as needed. Another thing that we can grow into, and you will see this when we look about the next version of this contract AI agent, is that we had to figure out a more effective way to chunk these out. One of the things that we notice is that when we run the OCR, just like anything else with this machine learning or with these AI LLMs, if you feed it way too much data, it gets sloppy in the results. So when it comes to a contract that's probably under 20 pages, it can handle that no problem. Contracts between 20 and let's say 1,000 pages, you do want to chunk those up into maybe 20-page chunks, send them to your OCR service, and then recombine them in the output in the right order, and then just store all of that data here as plain text here in the document library. That's going to be a more effective way. And again, this is why I love Power Agents in this way versus SharePoint Premium, because you can get more granular control over different steps in your process, right? You can get way more control in different steps in your process. Secondly, that chunking that we're going to be using for the OCR, we're going to have to use that same concept when we look at to vectorize all of these contracts. So why would we vectorize these contracts? So let me just take you here. When it comes to the vectorization, basically what we're looking to do is to create a Power App for our end user. And what they're going to do is go to this Power App, and there's just going to be, just like Google, just a simple text box. And now they can ask the question about contracts across the entire document library. When I say the entire document library of the documents that they have access to, right? This is a very handy tool for the legal team, a very handy tool for the data regulatory team, or even contracting in general that needs to see, okay, what type of contracts do we have out there? And you can do reporting on here. Now, we're vectorizing this because we want something richer than a keyword search. We want to have something that more of a semantic. Give me the context. How many contracts do we have dealing with renewable regulatory requirements in Ohio, right? That type of question, you have to pull in so many different pieces, and most of that may be a vector search or a vector query against a vectorized data source. And this is going to be our vector database. In the next one, we're going to go through the architecture design on how you pull that off. So I say all that to say, having control over the chunking for OCR, you're going to have that same concept when you're looking to do contract searches. Okay, so next, where do we have on the docket? One, we want to create a Dropbox for this, right? So a Dropbox is going to be anyone in the organization who want legal to review a contract. You're going to go to this designated site, and it's a document library, right? And then you're going to upload your contract. And based on the contract, we're going to do the exact same thing that you just saw. We're going to send it to our Power Automate. That could be triggered when a file is added or loaded, right? And then it's going to trigger that process, send that file down to our OCR agent, and it's going to stringify the blob, and then that's going to extract out where it needs to go. That prompt on the we give it a name, a contract router. That prompt for the router will have predefined libraries of where different types of contracts may live. And when I say predefined, because some of these contracts in certain organizations, you can't have every contract in one library. So not necessarily for a capacity, it's just that from security and things along those lines to keep it clean. So you may not have that luxury to your disposal. So you may need to route these to different contracts. So it would know after reading the plain text returned from the OCR where to route this contract. And it would have the library name, the URL to the site collection of that library, and then really just delete it from this one and then add it to that one. Once it adds it, the next step in this process would be, okay, based on that contract type, and I know the schema of that library, This is the data that needs to be extracted, right? And you can get very creative on how you do that, because on the Power Platform, we have trigger events working at our disposal and working in our favor. We have batch jobs that we can create working in our favor. We can have other events that we can trigger working in our favor. So we can do more so like a microservices approach, or a service architecture approach, or maybe like a simple batch job that just go and hunt. I love the microservices, meaning that this unit of work is going to be sleep, and then when it's needed, there's going to be an event that wakes it up. It's going to do some things, and when it's done, it's going to write to another event. It's going to write out another event, and that there's another process that listens to that to give a confirmation that it's done. If you have to trigger a workflow after that, you can piece all these together. Again, this is why Power Agents are starting to take a lot more traction now that we're getting through this co-pilot and this agent wave, because now what organizations are looking to do is, I need to infuse AI within the business process, and we're past a chatbot asking the questions and getting a response, asking the question and getting a response. Now we're looking at AI automation. Here's a document. Go ahead and route it to the right document library, extract all the metadata within that document, do the risk analysis, do executive summary, and then once it's done, send me an email with the executive summary so that way I can read it, right? Or, and that's the thing, some of these processes may take time, so it's not a, I'm gonna send you this and I'm gonna wait for it. It could be, I'm gonna send you this, I'm gonna send you these 20, and then send me an email when this is done, or send me a link to this Power App that's going to summarize all of these for me in a responsible way. That's where we're moving into. And the more and more you embrace your skill set, and your team starts to embrace their skill set within the Power Platform, is how all of these start to come together. You start to define those reusable frameworks. You start to define your standard operating procedures or your best practices on how you build your Power Automates to get the most leverage out of them, to get the most mileage out of them, building up and building that catalog of reusable components within it. Now, here's the other thing. This pattern scales, right? So we're using this in Power Agents, and this is just a contracting one. And I would say that contracting solution, let's take a look at it. This contracting solution, right, for this AI processor, I would say out of all of these flows, right, the only one, so let me screen grab this. So if we go back to the whiteboard here, if I paste in this screen grab, and you look at this contract, so this is our solution for the contract agent, right? And in here, just put a red check mark. This is reusable, this is reusable, this is reusable, right? So really the only thing that's unique to the contract solution is this process contracts here. When I say reusable, these were already built. You build these once and you reuse them as many times in different business scenarios. And these separation of concerns are really tight to where they're not business logic dependent. They're more functional dependent, meaning that this one here, the agent prompt, this is all this thing does is pass in the agent key. This is pass when it needs to prompt for the process contracts. It's going to pass in the agent key. It's going to say, oh, for risk analysis, you need this, and return that agent. And it's going to keep doing this. We encapsulated this because right now we grow in using this in the SharePoint list. This may grow to where this probably is better suited to be a SQL table or a Dataverse table. Again, changing the data source becomes very trivial because we're encapsulated and modularized in this way, right? This one here, no, actually, that's not a red check mark. This is a green one. This is contract to text. Basically, what this does is that, oh, I know where your contracts are. I know what library that is. I'm going to go to that library. I'm going to create a loop, and then I'm going to call this one for my inner to take the blob of that file, stringify it, send it to file to plain text, and it's going to return back the OCR plain text for that, and I'm gonna store it in the document library, right? So this one is germane to the contracts because this knows where the contract library is. It knows the schema of the contract library and all this other stuff. But the heavy lift of converting a blob to plain text, it doesn't need to trouble itself with that level of detail. It's reusing these components for that. Same here, chunking. And this is actually prepping for our search. So chunking the file. So again, you send me the blob, the plain text here. This takes plain text. It has a chunking strategy on how to chunk those up, how to vectorize them, and then it returns the vector for those chunks in the array. Once you have that, now you can go back and store that into an Azure AI search or Cosmo DB or any other vectorized database to where you want to chunk those out. How do you store that in Cosmo? How do you relate those chunks to the master record of the main contract library? All that is the business layer, right? Again, this is how you're taking some of your skills that you've grown from your pro development background or even your solution architect background to where you know the do not repeat yourself, right? The dry concept, doing things in modular, right? Creating repeatable services and all like those same concepts work in this manner. So at the end of the day, and I have these in the same solution, more so for troubleshooting. Now, if you don't know already, when it comes to solutions in the Power Automate, and I'll end with this, when it comes with solutions in Power Automate, any flow that's in the solution can be used across any other solution, right? So let me just make this one. So in this, we have this, right? We have an AI core solution, and this is our main LLM reusable here. So we defined that here when we first created it. And these solutions like this flow will leverage that. It's not going to cross over to this solution. It's just these are available to you when you look at child flows. Anything that's created across any flow in the same environment will be available to you in that child flow dropdown within it. So you can reference that. We bring these over temporarily within the solution. Just if we get an error or if we get that generic message like the flow didn't respond in time or didn't send a response or errored out, whatever the case may be, we can now quickly come here, look at the run history, go into that run history and see exactly where it failed. And 9 times out of 10, at this point, if it's reusable, this is already battle tested. So if you get an error, it's because of the parameter that you're passing. So you can reuse this. So I say all that to say, you're seeing a lot of these with the red check mark in this solution only because we're troubleshooting as we pass in parameters to them. Here's another enhancement that now we have to go back in some of these reusable ones and add in these capabilities. One, they just introduced, I just saw it. I don't know how long it's been out there. When I saw it, I was like, what the heck? Downs. That was one of the biggest pet peeves that we had with these child flows. Because you remember how I was telling you, like when you call that LLM, right? And the calling flow, I don't want to call it a parent because all of these are siblings of each other. It's just like, it's a network, right? So there's no hierarchy in this structure. These are all wheel spoke type architecture or almost like internet or networking type architecture where any one of these agents can call an agent that the agent is calling itself, that's calling it, right? So I say that with this flow here, when you call it, initially we were specifying which model. So it'd be like, oh, use 3.5 for this or use O3 mini for this or use 4.1 for yes and that. And we since then got away from that and say, you know what, send a generic. Is it standard? Is it reasoning? Is it research? Is it web? Is it ... And those have to be exact, right? The spelling has to be right. The casing has to be right. It can't be any trailing spaces or anything like that for your downstream to work as expected. So how we communicated that was in the comments of each one of these parameters. And sometimes developers would run through that and we know we have to keep training them that says, you know, what your available options here, even though this is a string parameter type, these are the 5 options you can use. and you have to type them in exactly like this. Obviously, any developer or app maker would know that. Since then, they introduced choice fields, which is fantastic, right? So it's still a string parameter, but now you will have a choice drop down that the developer can pick, and then that's where you have your finite list of options. So now what we want to do is upgrade all of these to use a choice, and we have to test it out that says, okay, if we convert this one text field, and that's the thing, you're going to have to convert your existing. I don't even know if that's an option or not. We'll find out. But if we can convert an existing to a choice, we just need to confirm that it doesn't break runtime, because we don't want developers to go back and say, hey, we updated this, now you have to go back and touch everything. We would rather them, if they're in there touching it, like the Power Automate would stop them, that says, hey, you know how you see it, like when you delete a field or something like that in like an update action, the Power Automate will stop you and say, hey, this column no longer exists, now you need to fix it. We would rather have that go through that natural nutrition to start using this drop down. But yeah, that's things like that do come up. The other option we love, because that's the other thing we were concerned with this model, was how does it scale? What if you wanted to add a third parameter to like agent prompt, and currently right now it only has 2, right? And can you add that third parameter as an optional one, so that way any existing flows that's calling it aren't breaking because they're missing their required column, and you can introduce that so net new people can take advantage of it. So we're still playing around with those types of options here. And that one is true, right? That one you can add an optional parameter so it doesn't break the existing. And so that scale, that maintenance story, that adding more features and capabilities to it, even though we are encapsulated, we are using a modular approach, we want to make sure that holds true. Okay, so let's wrap this up. What are we doing next? Next, we need to create that Dropbox as we showed before, right? And that Dropbox is going to say, you don't need to, as a user, you don't need to know where these contracts need to go. You just need to come here and drop them in. And you can drop in, and we want them to be able to drop in bunches. Just hit that add file, go to the folder where it has, do a Control A to select everything, and hit OK, and it brings in 10 files, 100 files. I don't know if 1,000 would be supported. I think it's going to be a document library. So whatever upload capability limitations that SharePoint libraries have, we want to adhere to that. So that's going to be one. Handling incoming emails. Here's another one. You may have vendors emailing the contracting team, right, on new SOWs or whatever, and they may be coming in from the outside. So now we want to have a mailbox, right? And this could be shared mailbox, wherever the case may be, a mailbox monitoring or designated for this. And then we have a Power Automate monitoring this. When new mail is sent, then it goes and do its thing. There's a lot of nuances. We understand we have to play around with that, right? To make sure that the mail that's been sent is actually a new contract and not a response to a previous email. Those we want to ignore. There's a forward email. Maybe the vendor sent it to an actual person. That person knows that it should be going to this contracting library or inbox, so they forward that mail over. So making sure we extract out the right data. Is there one attachment or the multiple attachments, whatever the case may be. So we want to make sure we handle that. The other one would be to create an AI search. Again, this is that search box I was talking about. As a legal representative or a contracting manager or a governance team, whatever the case may be, allow them to search across all contracts, metadata, date ranges, details within the contract, risk level, you name it. This takes a certain type of vector database to pull this off. We ran into issues with Azure AI Search, which is why we converted over from using that to a different pattern to where we can get more of a query-like, more of a search-like, more of a full text, keyword, and semantic vector searching. We need all of them available to the user to make sure we're creating valuable results. What does that mean exactly? If you know a contract ID, you punch that in, you want to get exactly that ID. You don't need a fuzzy match with vectors and all this other good stuff. If you need a date range, I'm looking for all lease agreements in Ohio for purple cars, for our purple vehicles, or for our trucks, for our utility trucks. Things that, when you say utility trucks, there's probably many different vehicle types within your fleet that fit that description. We don't want the onus to be on the user. I know they can ask a much quality question, but we want to take a shot at that, right? So we know what the range is. So that's query parameters. Start time is greater or equal to this. Start time is less than equal to this. These are vehicles, boom, boom. Maybe it has a history of what vehicles look like. So asking those type of generic questions, scope to contracts, and getting quality results, right? So we're going to look at that. The other one would be, remember how I was struggling to say, oh, we want them to be able to search, and we said maybe we'll send them to a Power App, or maybe there would be like a React. Like we're now playing around with the idea of using React for vibe coding React front ends with Logic App or Power Automate service enabled backends, and then seeing how that feed and hosting that React app in Azure Functions or Azure Web App. Much different concept, but what we're seeing here, if we can fine tune it to get it to work, the UI is magnitudes richer than what you would get with a Power App, and the level of effort to produce it is fraction of the time of creating a Power App. This is why we're getting very aggressive with this, because anytime that we encounter something like this is better quality and we can do it in a fraction of the time, let's figure out the other wrinkles. Let's iron out the other wrinkles to make this happen in an enterprise way, like GitHub check-in, maintenance requests, adding on to it, adding new features. Is this really a no-code, low-code solution for non-developers? Or is this something like all of this, right? So it's worth figuring that workflow out, because the results are significantly better and the time is significantly less, right? So if you're getting better results in a fraction of the time, the other stuff that's missing is worth figuring it out, right? So we're starting to look into that. So I say all that to say, what we're starting to see now, especially for large orgs, a lot of them live in Teams and a lot of them live in Outlook. So for Microsoft Teams, if we can embrace the Microsoft Teams AI library for these, I think this will be a huge win for the user, because now you are interacting with your team. Maybe there's a Teams message, maybe there's a one-on-one chat message, and a question about a contract comes up. Maybe you're chatting with someone in legal, and they'll say, oh yeah, I'm looking for the status of this contract. And they give them the name. And then both of you all can mention your Teams bot, give it the contract name, or you can search on contracts, or you can do whatever you can do in the search box. But in the comfort of Microsoft Teams, this gives a much different experience for the end user. And if they're already in Teams, it minimizes context switching. So this is the whole concept Microsoft's been preaching since 2006 or 2016, is bring the data to where your users are. That's why you see in Microsoft 365, there's 5 ways to get a unit of work done, because they give, if you're team centric, they're going to bring that to you. That's why the tab feature in Teams is so strong. If you're SharePoint centric, they're going to bring the work to you. So that way you can use navigation or links or quick links to link off to these different apps, pop them up in a different tab, do your work, close that tab, and stay in the concentration of SharePoint. The same is true for Outlook, right? Me personally, I haven't jumped into building out actions within Outlook, but that's the same concept. Like, how do you find a toolbar, create your own toolbar within Outlook, have them review contracts, that same that you see with the integration with Zoom and Outlook, the integration with Teams and Outlook. So imagine if you had a similar button in Outlook for contracts, or for, I don't know, make it up, SharePoint provisioning sites, or team provisioning sites, or rewriting emails using AI, or auto responding to emails using AI, or one-click out of Office where it clears your schedule, it reschedules the meetings that you're the owner of, and it sends messages out to key people who need to be aware that you're going to be out of the office. So things like that you can take advantage of. It's really just getting into that ecosystem. And most of these are going to be REST API enabled, which is going to allow all of this to continue to work in that scenario. And for all of those different front doors that, that I described, we're not rebuilding any of these solutions to satisfy that. So we're really just building a different front door. But once you're in, the how you navigate, what tools you have, what the downstream process and workflow is, it's all going to remain the same, right? So that's going to be very interesting. And then the last one is going to be cost savings provisioning measures. We know that, like for this example, this was a POC for an acquisition. The company that was being acquired was bringing over like 600,000 documents, contracts. And that's what forces down this road of contract type, for example. And you can't be dependent on how the file is named. You have to read the document to come up with that answer. And it's pretty quick, right? You can do it in a fraction of a second. But anyway, so when you're dealing with documents at scale, like hundreds of thousands of documents, and you need to process this. Imagine if you're migrating a file share from on-prem file share with this elaborate folder structure. And now you want to dump that into a SharePoint library and you want to extract out different metadata. Maybe you want to extract out different clauses or details about the document, the type of document it is. Sometimes these file shares have been living for several decades. The naming convention changed over time. The structure changed over time. They may be consistently wrong on how they were storing documents, and now you need to clean that up. Fantastic example of how you would leverage something similar to this. So doing that at scale, processing 5, 10, 50 terabytes of file share data using AI, you want to make sure you do that in a reasonable rate. Yeah, it's going to cost money, but it's going to be way cheaper than human capital, right? I'm not blowing any smoke about it. This will cost money, but it's going to be a fraction. None of this is going to be free, right? But it's not going to be a license requirement. It's going to be pay for the usage or the meter for these backend services. But I say all that to say there is a batch process you can take advantage of in Azure OpenAI. So in which you pay almost like a fraction of the cost if you were running it during the day. So this is where we want to optimize. So when we set up that scheduled job to go through all 600,000 documents stored in a document library, we want to do that in a batch way to where we're taking full advantage of that batch process. And the thing with that batch process, you can send a request any time of day. It's just that it will only execute at night. So now you need to have a monitoring job that says, oh, here's the response for contract 123. And you respond to that, you know where to store the results in the SharePoint library, and you get rocking and rolling. Don't do what I did. Don't store the results in the wrong column like what you see here. So, things like that. We're storing it in the right column. And usually that process would be our OCR. So it's going to be stored in the raw text column to where we are grabbing all the plain text representation for all of these files, and we're doing it at night, and we're paying a fraction of the cost because we're doing it in the batch that may process out overnight. Okay, so that's going to be next. Those are going to be our enhancements. So let me know if this makes sense. Let me know what questions you have. I'm very curious into understanding how you are leveraging your Power Platform skills and implementing AI. And even if you're not doing the Power Platform route, what are you using to implement AI for these business processes? Because the business needs it. Like, the stats are staggering, right? There's money that's leaking because we're not getting ahead of this contracting issue that organizations have. And like I said, the numbers I gave you were average, median. Those can be lower depending on the line of work you're in and how large the organization is. And those can be exponentially larger depending on the line of work you're in and how many contracts you're processing. Okay, so until then, I'll see you in the next. Definitely leave me a comment. Let me know. I'm really interested in feedback on how you're operating or how you're executing, and we'll go from there.